pervasive bug going around right now.
Yeah. So.
Not just in Mike's house, but certainly in Mike's house.
Thank you for asking.
Faith is excited about the baby.
Faith loves the baby. Yeah, yeah, she sure does. And the baby's starting to talk a bit and yammer. So she's having a good time. Yep. We ready, Turkey?
Yeah, you guys are on.
Oh, we're on. Okay.
We're on.
I evidently wasn't paying attention.
There you go.
No, you're good, Tammy. You're good. He's supposed to wave more impressively, but
You know, he's been out of the booth for several
yes,
days
there you
lately.
go. That's what I was
That's
waiting
much better.
for.
We can get him some of those orange flashlights like at the airport.
Yeah, yeah.
I actually had a college professor who over-exaggerated that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I can see why now. Anyways,
That's probably because you weren't paying attention, though.
welcome to Loveworth's Apologetics night, the third Wednesday here. So we are fired up and ready to go with our second session on the Tower of Babel. This will be part 10 of our session. So the things we talked about last time, we went over the section regarding this primarily is Genesis 11, 1 through 9. We discussed the historical literature references for the tower and the city of Babel with Josephus and Herodotus and those guys. And then we talked about how it made sense that everyone spoke the same language. And then the fact that a sufficient population would have been more than possible in the time period after the flood. We went over those numbers. We also talked about how the people had access to the bricks and the asphalt building materials. They were able to make all that. And how many cultures across the world reference the Tower of Babel event in their histories, similar to the flood event. And the location of the tower and the archaeological history of the site, as well as looking at what we believe to be the ruins of the tower. And how the physical design of the tower as a ziggurat is reflected in ancient architectural structures all around the world. I did discover this week that I have a very hard time spelling ziggurat.
It's not easy.
Well, it's not something you can run across every day.
Kelly can spell it off the top of her head. No problem. Yeah, she gets the
she's
double
she's
G's
good,
and everything.
That's a weird word.
Yeah, English majors. Anyways, and how the ancient architectural structures all around the world reflect that. So, today we're going to discuss the anthropology and the archaeology related to the dispersal of the human civilization from this area across the globe, the linguistic consequences of the Lord generating many different languages at one time, and the genealogical evidence relating different geographical populations to the distribution from Babel. Now, I'm not going to lie to you. I have been watching hours and hours and hours of video that will, frankly, some of these topics will probably draw the life right out of your soul. I have
But please, don't tune out.
some videos today that have trimmed down to just the exciting parts, give you some exposure to what it is, and we can talk about the general stuff. It's not long now. Got about 40 minutes, Pete. So, a few other quick notes I wanted to go ahead and talk about first, specifically about the first two verses of Genesis 11 here. Genesis 11:1 is very specific that everyone on the earth spoke the same language. I didn't actually talk about this last time, but the verse says, now the whole earth had one language and one speech. The word there for language is sapha. It refers to the lip in that they had one uniform manner of speech. Okay? But what it also does is the word for speech is daba, and it refers literally to how they had one uniform understanding of vocabulary. Okay, so it's not like they had a bunch of regional dialects where they were basically all speaking English, but they were speaking different words. Like we do here in the South versus people in Maine. Not knocking any Maine people or anything.
Good. Randy Brush.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand you.
I'm not from Maine, but
I'm sorry, I had that actually
You must
written
have
in my
that Maine
notes.
dialect.
No, you're good.
I am.
So, now, Genesis 11:2 is a fine point that I think is worth making here, and it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. So the reason why I wanted to speak about this particular verse, it does not technically mean that all the people of the world were in this one spot, okay? And I just want to make sure we kind of got that understanding here. But a large number of the people relative to that would have been gathered here. It's further evidenced by the post-flood dispersion, and I actually have a video that will talk about this just a little bit, in that while everyone was in the general region of Mesopotamia, there would have been some other communities and descendants of Noah beyond those gathered at Babel. So Babel is really the first attempt to make a city, per se. Okay, so there were other like villages and groups of people around. And we can see that in some of the archaeology from after the fact due to the things that the people that dispersed from Babel, what they did when they left Babel. They actually took out some small villages and stuff and took over their place and did things like that. So I just wanted to make that finer point. And it has to do with the Hebrew grammar in this verse that helps us get to that understanding that it's not necessarily referring that all people are in this one spot. Oh, as a matter of fact, here is the video. So the short little video here by Dr. Doug Petrovich. And oh, it's working. It's working.
Map interesting to you as an archaeologist rather than a map of anywhere else in the world?
Well, the events of the Bible are unfolded in the ancient Near East, which includes Mesopotamia, the Levant, Anatolia, modern Turkey, Egypt. So all of these lands are extremely important to understanding how and what took place in the biblical text.
Doug, we've been looking at the Genesis record, and we've been looking at the major events there, the creation and then the flood. And we've looked at a lot of the evidence associated with that. But now we get to your area. After the flood, we have Noah's family. And my understanding is that this is exactly where all of this begins. Take us back to that record, and what do you see? How did all of that play out?
Well, certainly in Genesis 9, Noah and his family settled on Mount Ararat, which of course is not conclusively identified, and it could be a number of sites along the mountain
Somewhere
range.
up in here.
Yeah, somewhere to the northeast of Mesopotamia. And they would have dispersed undoubtedly in all directions from there. And by the time we get to Genesis 10 and the Table of Nations, we see a thread of not necessarily the geography of where all of those people went, but through the genealogies, we see that those indeed became peoples who dispersed according to the instruction that was given after the flood, because just as at the beginning with Adam, you had the instruction to multiply and fill the earth, that same command was reiterated after the flood, and the peoples did that very thing and spread and so forth. And that, of course, leads to Genesis 11, where you have a centralization of a number of those peoples. And certainly the intent of Genesis 11 is not to suggest that all of the peoples of the earth now recollected in one area, but simply that a large number of them got together in one area and moved toward the process of urbanization, city living.
Always.
Yeah. Yeah. That's,
Christiana, no problems. Murfreesboro, a mess.
hey. I'll agree. Being from Eagleville, I'll agree. Perfect.
Okay.
So yeah, that's the summation of what I wanted to say there. I just felt he did a better way of saying it than I did. Is that you have any thoughts on that?
No.
Okay, good. Anyways, so let's talk a little bit about the confusion of speech. How many languages did the Lord develop? It's a perfectly good question. Right now we have estimated about 6,900 spoken languages on the face of the earth. Okay. Now, linguists that go and analyze all this stuff and create thousands of hours of video that people can watch, okay, they basically boil this down to a categorization of around 100 root languages, okay, that all these other languages spring forth from. And we see that in, like, for instance, the Germanic languages and all the things, the Italian and the French and all those sorts, and that kind of interrelationship.
87 kinds of Chinese, right? There's like
Yeah,
1,000
so
different
I personally believe. Did you have a question?
Yeah.
What's your question?
So were the dispersion of languages, is this where the development of different races as well?
We will actually talk about that in just a little bit.
Okay.
Okay, we will discuss that.
people adapted to the environment.
So I do believe that the original language, whatever language, say, Adam spoke, okay, and then passed down to his successors, I do believe that original language actually preserved in this process. There is some discussion about it being destroyed for reasons that are incredibly complicated and would take probably 2 or 3 nights to talk about. They're having to do with the Toledos in the Genesis and how Genesis is actually written and all that stuff. There's reasonable evidence that Moses had some reference documents that he used in the writing of Genesis, and those reference documents would have been in an original language prior to the Tower of Babel. Thus, it is reasonable that he was able to understand them because of some foreknowledge or knowledge that God gave him,
Like reference
and
notes
things like
that
that.
Noah's family wrote down, or somewhere along that
That
line?
there's actually some reasonable argument that actually Adam did some writing. Remember, Adam was around for 900 years.
Yeah.
And there's some reasonable evidence when analyzing Genesis and its structure of how Hebrew handles historical writing and stuff like that, that there were some reference pieces that he was...
Noah might have had Adam's writing on the ark, which then eventually got down to
got down to the point where that could be used
Can you
in
imagine?
a conjunctive reference.
the first guy. Having
Like I said, there's a lot of talking to be done about that.
And a lot of speculation.
And there's an awful lot of speculation because we don't have any reference. It literally has to do with analyzing the structure of Genesis and some of the Hebrew words that are used. And there appears to be this reference to a manuscript structure. And there's reasonable argument for it. And I couldn't rule it out. And
That wouldn't really surprise me either. As when we were doing Jude, the thing about Enoch, come up that Enoch had written stuff down, right? Well, how do people know? Well, they said that book of Enoch was carried by Noah on the
yeah, and actually the way it refers to the book of Enoch, that's one of those references that is used in Genesis to develop kind of that same understanding, because there is some of that same language that's used in Genesis when he talks about that. So that one I expected to just breeze right past. That's good. I'm glad you guys are paying attention and interested. Language is also very complicated. I know I don't have to tell you that, but also has a tendency to show up in a genuinely more complex form. Okay, languages have a tendency to simplify over time. All right, and if you think not even too hard about English, okay, you can see how this works. So, for instance, languages, while they gain more words, they increase their vocabulary, they tend to simplify their structural grammar and the physical construction of how the language works. So, for instance, English, compare the complexities of phraseology and sentence structure of Shakespeare versus modern written English. Okay, so that's early modern English versus today's English. I think we'd all agree that that's a more complex form of writing than what we have now. And we can look at this also in changes of the English language over the last 1,000 years. There's a reasonable reference here using Matthew 6:9 as a comparison, the beginning of the model prayer there. Our current English, the New King James, says, "Our Father in heaven." Late modern English from the 1700s says, "Our Father who art in heaven." Okay. Early modern English from 15 to 17 says, "Our Father which art in," to me it says hewen. we can interpret that different ways. Middle English from 11 to 15, it says, "Our Father that art in Hunis." Okay. It actually goes back, there's quite a bit of Germanic reference in early English, and we get closer to that original Germanic structure, especially in Old English, so AD 1000. I mean, frankly, sounds like Swiss to me, Swedish. It's a Swedish chef.
Yeah, exactly. That's all I can think of.
And the English language has changed quite a bit in how it structures its sentences. We move more to prepositions and some additional adjectives and stuff, whereas the original construct of the language had a much greater amount of finesse to it. There was kind of like in Hebrew, where we talk about the context of different words and their structure based on the words next to them and stuff. The original English structure is quite a bit like that. And a lot of languages start off that way, and then they move towards a simpler form. This is basically true of all the European languages that we can study. I couldn't find anybody that had studied the African languages in such a bent, but I wouldn't be surprised if it had a similar result in that. You know, we say that the young people are lazy and they're messing up the language.
Well, look at text messages.
It always gets me.
Yeah, text messages. How are we going to explain that? That might be getting more complicated.
TDH, they're getting crazy.
What always gets me is to go back and read like peasants from the Civil War writing this incredibly flowery, beautiful language.
Beautiful, poetic.
This guy
That wasn't very long ago.
his whole life, and yet,
Exactly.
you know, like, come on, man. That's,
So the next level is our dad above.
Our dad up there in the pretty place. I don't know.
The man of states. People in the South say it all the time. The man of states.
I mean, it's pretty clear at this point. It's just collapse, right? You can't get much further.
So
All goes to mush.
let's talk about some of the archaeological evidence for the mass movement of people groups out of Babel. And this again, Dr. Doug Petrovich, I moved forward a couple minutes in that video. I do apologize for the abrupt nature of the starts and stops in these, but I had to make them fairly quick.
Doesn't watch the whole.
Period of the late Uruk period, the Uruk expansion.
And is that right here?
The period of the late Uruk period, the Uruk expansion.
And is that right here?
So the expansion takes place from Eridu, and people are expanding outward. We have signs of the expansion to the north, to the south, to the east, to the west, all the way as far as Egypt, and of course throughout the Levant and even into Anatolia as well. So as this expansion took place, of course, it's going to be the largest, you're going to see the largest remnant of the expansion in the area that's closest to the city of Babel, which is Eridu. And that largest city that developed was the city of Uruk itself, which is the type site for the Uruk period.
Mm-hmm. And when you say evidence, that is the artifacts that we find in these archaeological digs?
Exactly. There's an enormous amount and very specific kinds of material culture that attest to this expansion of people that I'm connecting to the post-Babel dispersion. Mm-hmm. Here we have some bevel rim bowls, which are diagnostic of the Uruk period. These forms of pottery are very easy to manufacture, and basically they were molded. So there would have been molds made to be able to put clay into each of the molds, and that it would have been spread to the side. Then they would have been allowed to cure in the sun. But they could make it very rapidly. I mean, it's the same kind of technology basically that we have with the Ford assembly line. This was an assembly line for the making of pottery, and it coincides with urbanization, because when you have a much larger group of people living in one area, you have to more efficiently take care of all of those people.
That's why you then build a mold.
Exactly, exactly. And we have fingerprints on many of the bevel rim bowls that show that they were made by hand. And there's other important artifacts as well, such as those two spouted jars. And those spouted jars In larger form, these are smaller versions, but in larger form, the spouted jars are also diagnostic, actually for the Middle Uruk period. And during the late Uruk period, for the larger ones, which were beer jars, they would tilt the spout and droop it down to prevent air from coming in and causing the beer to go bad. And then we have these important administrative tablets, these clay tablets, that really were the precursor to writing. And the late Uruk period actually was the very moment before we have written language beginning.
So this is the time when we really begin to see human beings either begin to write or to develop the language to produce symbols for writing.
Absolutely, and it all began with clay tablets that were used to represent accounting for numbers of sheep, numbers of goats, and other things. And from this, writing itself developed.
Doug, how does all of this, these artifacts that we see here, how do they fit into your view then of the Tower of Babel? Does it connect here?
It does, because all of these diagnostic forms of pottery and material culture, they're found throughout the Near East, because the people from the site of Eridu expanded to the east, to the south, to the north, and especially, we know of, to the west, all the way into Israel and Egypt. And we find the same kinds of bevel rim bowls there. We find four-lug jars. We find Riemchen bricks. We find the same monumental architecture, such as the tripartite buildings, and we find spouted jars all throughout these areas. And that is essentially a remnant of this movement of people outward. And this expansion, known as the Uruk expansion, which I'm connecting with the Tower of Babel, I'm saying that the Bible describes an event that's not just the confusion of language, but it's the dispersing of people far from that city. And the city of Eridu was abandoned immediately after the late Uruk period and not occupied again for hundreds and hundreds of years. So all of this material culture gives us a window into the events that are connected with the Tower of Babel.
And it's from these artifacts that you can see that expansion.
That's right.
So this bevel rim bowl that you seem very excited about, are you saying then that helps you connect all of these people and their movement?
Absolutely. In fact, the bevel rim bowl is one of the most diagnostic forms of pottery and material culture for this entire expansion that shows that this people group moved out from Eridu.
Does that also help you understand that that must have been a rapid movement because you don't see change in those bowls?
Yes, it shows us that at an immediate moment in time, people literally packed their bags and left the area of southern Mesopotamia. And they show up in other places throughout the ancient Near East. And what's different about this expansion, in contrast to the earlier Ubaid expansion, the other of two expansions that took place during the pre-historical period, the Uruk expansion is characterized by a very different way of interacting and way of settling. And let me give you a couple examples. First of all, we have a lot of sites that were established on virgin soil. Also, wherever they settled with people, either there was an attack of the community, the people in the community already there, and they would literally wipe them out and take over, or if they lived among them, they would live in what we call the world's first segregated living. They would live in the same vicinity as the original occupants, but next door, not intermingling and living in the same houses on the same streets.
So we have evidence then of different people groups now for the first time.
Absolutely. And the world's first segregated life.
So that would be the evidence or the symptom, I guess, of what you would expect of those people that were dispersed from the Tower of Babel, now with a different language and immediately a different people group.
Right. And that's why we have segregated living, because they weren't able to blend with one another, converse with one another. So it makes sense that they would live in separate areas around the town. And the same dynamic happens within big cities all around the world where you have multiple people groups. A people group comes in, they can't speak the local language, and they develop a community within that city that's a very ethnically singular group of people.
Doug, the issue of language is very interesting. And that's part of archaeology, isn't it? Because you see the evidences of language. What do you see in that evidence?
Well, it's absolutely important because once language is found in the archaeological record, we now have communication from the people of that day that are telling us something about themselves. And writing is the expression of that communication. And the clay tablets that we've looked at here are an important aspect of that because they're from a transitional point where written language had not been developed yet. And they were on the verge of it. And we see on their tablets that they make, there are strokes and there are pictures that we call pictographs. And then after the period of the late Uruk expansion, we see language develop in different places, probably first in Mesopotamia, with the strokes that were used on these clay tablets now becoming part of the cuneiform script. And in other places such as Egypt, we see hieroglyphics. That's the result of pictographs that also were part of the original clay tablet writing mechanism.
Doug, what I hear you saying is that it's as if languages just pop up, they begin to appear. Is that how you see it, and does that support then the Genesis paradigm?
Absolutely, it supports the Genesis paradigm because we see the written expression of language just pop up out of nowhere, and then different languages being represented through cuneiform script or through hieroglyphic script or other means. So language is something that it will break down over time. It goes from complex to simple. And we see that reflected in the archaeological record in the form of tablets and other forms of text.
Well, that's very interesting because we've been looking at physical design and how the design of very exquisite physical things had to be in place all at once, and then it decays from there. You're saying that that is the same thing we see in language.
It's the same dynamic with language as well. Grammar of language is very specific to the certain given language. We have various expressions of grammar that are in languages that are not found in other languages. So the very fact that we have aspects of language that are diverse between languages. Some languages have a certain moods, some has that others don't. Some have certain tenses that others don't. Some have forms of describing things that are different than other languages. So you do not have a universal plan that's followed among all of the languages. You see great diversity in the forms of grammar from language to language, even in ancient languages. Basically, this incredible dynamic of language, which becomes expressed in different ways with different scripts around the entire ancient Near East, and a great diversity within these languages and their grammatical forms, all of that reflects a very sudden ability to communicate writing. So all of this fits perfectly with what we would see as the biblical account of how languages took place. It's really the only way of explaining this. So the integrity of biblical history ultimately is justified by the expression of these languages.
Doug, I know that you have spent a lot of time looking at that issue of the Tower of Babel and trying to understand actually where it really did occur. What have you found?
Well, what I've found essentially is a gold mine within the historical and archaeological record. And basically, the site of Eridu was called Babel in ancient times in a number of sources. And it's one of 7 or 8 cities that were called Babel. And it's the only one that meets all of the historical requirements for the Tower of Babel. It was around at the right time. We have diagnostic pottery and other forms of material culture from the late Uruk period that are found at Eridu. And we have very fascinating 2 forms of monumental architecture. One, we have a temple that existed in 18 different phases, and at every phase it grew in its size and its complexity. And that final phase of the temple, it was abandoned immediately, right at the time of the late Uruk expansion. And catacornered to the temple was an absolutely enormous platform. And that platform was so large, it dwarfed this large temple that existed.
You think that could be the foundation of the Tower of Babel?
Absolutely. In fact, what archaeology demonstrates is that the foundations of that temple display the kinds of diagnostic material culture from the later Uruk period. And they found that the original bricks that were added onto it were from that period. But it was never completed. It wasn't until hundreds of years later, during the third dynasty of Ur, that the kings of the dynasty decided that this eyesore in their neighboring city of Eridu was no longer to sit uncompleted. So they completed this structure, which is exactly what we see in other areas around Mesopotamia and beyond, known as a ziggurat. And the ziggurat essentially is the equivalent of a tower. So I would suggest to you that that uncompleted tower that wasn't completed until hundreds of years later at Eridu, on that massive platform, that is the Tower of Babel.
Wow. Now, most of us think today of a tower, the kinds of things we see in big cities, big straight walls. Is that what they were building?
Well, essentially it's a variation of a pyramid. And there were 4 sides to it and several stairways that would go up to the top. But these ziggurats weren't restricted even to Mesopotamia. We find forms of these ziggurats all around the globe. And I would suggest to you that this later Uruk expansion, where this technology began, where this form of monumental architecture began, was something that spread with the people. Because even though they spoke different languages, they went where they went with their own culture, their own technological background and understanding, and their own abilities to build and construct, that they all shared together there at Babel, which, again, I'm calling the city of Eridu.
Yes.
Is what he's talking about the same site as the...
That site that we looked at, honestly, I couldn't figure out whether or not it was exactly the same site.
Yeah.
There are a couple different ones. This guy appears to have spent much of his natural life studying this issue, so I'm willing to conclude what he concluded was probably better than my conclusion on that issue. But the referencing, it's within a 20-mile area of that. So
He did bring up something that I thought was really interesting. I'd never ever thought about this before. Tell me if I'm understanding what he said correctly. That all of these languages in that area seem to have sprung up at the same time, fully formed. Like there's no evidence of them starting with some
correct.
phrases
So
that became a language.
the only way we can reference it is in the written form. Okay.
Yeah.
And we think about it kind of like fossils, where if you're going to argue evolution, you would expect to see an evolution in the fossils, right? A gradient stage that leads to the end goal. And we don't see that. And the same thing happens in these writings, where basically the format of the writing appears as a whole.
Yeah. Like it was created.
Like it was created.
Yeah.
And then it moves on from there. We don't see
Integration.
A large degree. Now we can say we believe that the technique came from things like those stones, where you see kind of the early idea of where this came from, but there's nothing that seems to be a direct relationship between those stones and the cuneiform writings that you saw in those forms.
Okay.
That's
I've never ever thought to consider that.
Here's what I wanted to get across in this guy. The notion of the archaeology proving the expansion of the population. Think about it like everybody in Oklahoma City had an iPhone 1, okay? And they were all of a sudden, you had 10,000 people in Oklahoma City that were dispersed, okay? Now, they all took their iPhone 1 with them. And say, for instance, they knew how to generate more iPhone 1s, okay? This is the technology of the time. That's what the bowl that he's excited about is like an iPhone, okay? It's the technology of the time is expressed in their ceramics, okay? So these guys took a mold, they put the clay in it, and they spread it out against the mold. That's why their fingerprints are on the inside. And then it had a beveled off top. It's a very simple way of doing things, but you can make them very quickly. What you could identify is how far that people group made it because they had an iPhone 1. Okay? Now, once you start getting an iPhone 2 and a 3 and a 4 and an 8, your ability to track progress gets reduced. Okay? So that's why I said your greatest form of evidence is going to be in that region. because over the period of 100 years, their way of making pottery changes. And that's why this works like it does. So he can say, well, we have a large group of people that are spread out very quickly because they're all using the same ceramic form that we know derived from this region, because we have older examples from this city, okay, and there's a lot of it. So they took that technology with them. So it's not only that they left the city of Babel with a new language, they also left with the technology and their knowledge and the understanding of what they had accomplished up to that point. Okay, does that make sense? Not everybody was starting from scratch. That's kind of exemplified in the form of the global distribution of the ziggurat, like we talked about last time, and South America and stuff like that, where we basically see that same physical structure, maybe slightly different personifications of it, like the next iteration, but that same construct globally in that form. Does that make sense?
Yep.
All right, good. Now, so where did the people go? So this genealogy is actually a quite fascinating construct here. There's a great deal of information available tracking specific dispersion from descendants of Noah across the globe. Keep in mind that we have a modern construct of the Jewish people group that are able to trace their genealogy to a long, long time ago because they kept written records that long. So there is this man by the name of James Anderson. He was hired back in the 1700s by a prince of England. I could never figure out exactly which prince it was, but he hired this guy to go back and do all the research and get with all the people groups and everything and figure out where royalty came from. He wanted to do, there's some evidence that he was trying to break the royal lineages of certain countries by being able to negate their claim to royal blood and stuff like that. So he paid this guy a great deal of money to go out and do this research, and he generated a lot. Okay, a gentleman by the name of Bodie Hodge, who works with the the Answers in Genesis group. He works with them very extensively. He does this massive chase through different people groups as descendants directly of the lineage of Noah, using references like this, James Anderson and some others. And it's really, it can be a super fascinating study or a kind of a dreary one. So what I did was I boiled it down to one instance, okay? And this is a construct of the people of Spain as traced back to Noah, okay, which means it would have been distributed through Babel. So let's look at this one here.
So where did the Spanish come from? So let's kind of shift down there just a little bit, because there's actually a connection between some of the Irish and some of the Spanish as well. But at the same time, Spain is a melting pot. It really was, particularly in ancient times. If you think of where their position is at the Mediterranean Sea, as people go all the way across it, it kind of becomes a melting pot specifically. So yeah, you have people coming from the sea, people coming from land once again. If you look at James Anderson, with a lot of the information he put together, he has Spain going back through Japheth and particularly Tubal. This is, again, one of Noah's grandsons, Tubal. In fact, the land of Spain had been known as the land of Tubal. One of Tubal's various names was Iberes. He ended up naming one of his sons Iberus. But think about this. We still call that peninsula the Iberian Peninsula even today. And what's interesting is Tubal, yeah, he settled in Spain for a particular amount of time. Some of his descendants ended up going up between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. If you look there, Caucasian Iberia. The way the history goes, Tubal lived in Spain for a long time, but then he migrated over there and actually lived in between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea for quite some time. And some of his descendants continued to move north, going up into the Russian area that we now call Tubal or Tobolsk. Even the name Siberia, if you drop the S, you can still see a reflection of the name Iberes in there. The Greeks called him Iberes, by the way. But the way his history goes, he ended up moving back to Spain, and then he moved down into what we call Morocco. And in Morocco, he ended up dying down there, and that's where he was buried, somewhere down in that particular area. So we have a big piece of history in there, but I want to back up one. If you look at some of the various names of Tubal, and this is very common for a lot of the sons, grandsons, and great-grandsons of Noah, because at the Tower of Babel, all these different languages come out, and believe it or not, different people have various names. We see a lot of names of Noah in different cultures, different names of Noah's wife, and so forth. But some of the variant names of Tubal was Jubal, Pluto, which is elevated to a godlike status in some of the mythological cultures. One of his names was Atlas Mauritanius, and so you can see where the name Mauritania even comes from, and the Moors and some of those particular names. But you also see Atlas, and there's variations of that because some of the descendants of Tubal here ended up going back to Italy and settling in that particular area, and they became known as the Italics, and that's where we get the name Italy even today. That's a variation of the name Atlas. We still have the Atlas Mountains in Morocco and some of those areas there as well. But you'll see a reflection of some of these names. Sometimes you don't always know it. But notice the name Gibraltar down there, Tubal's grandson. We still have Gibraltar, which is owned by Great Britain. It's British people that are in there right now. But you still see a reflection of those names that have been there for quite some time. Now, you might think, okay, wow, we got Spain figured out. It's nice and easy. But like I said earlier, it was a melting pot. And there's a lot of other groups that ended up making it into Spain as well. Some of the descendants of Shem's son Aram, that's where we get the name the Arameans or the Syrians, the old language of Aramaic. Of course, Aramaic that we know of today is actually West Chaldee. After the Babylonians came in and conquered Aram in that area, the Aramaic that we know of there is actually a Hebrew type of language. But at any rate, we also have some of the descendants of Magog and Bath that ended up there. The Milesians, going back to Milo here, he was the third generation king in Spain, ended up migrating in there. So we have so much with regards to Spain. Here's another one. This is also outlined in James Anderson's Royal Genealogies, going back to Javan. Javan, just so you know, is the Hebrew name for Greece. So you have some of the Grecians that made it that far. One of the areas in the Iberian Peninsula is Tarshish. And there was the city of Tarshish. Jonah tried to flee to that. So he was probably trying to get all the way across the Mediterranean Sea to get over there. And that particular area was taken over by the Phoenicians a little bit later. So you can see there's all sorts of people groups that are making their way into Spain. And of course, we have a Gaulish people that made it onto the peninsula as well. We call that Portugal. Of course, not all the people there are Gaulish in Portugal, by the way, but that's a whole other discussion. So just in short, these are some of the groups that I've been able to trace into Spain. You got some of the descendants of Tubal, some from Aram, some from Magog, some of the Libyans and Egyptians, which came out of Noah's grandson Mitzrayim, that's how that's pronounced, made it there. Some of the Greeks from Javan, the Phoenicians from Canaan, and then, of course, we've had a whole groups of people come in there really since those early ages as well. Whew, boy. That'll make your brain explode seeing all these different names. I hope that doesn't scare everybody, but
this guy is fantastic. He has a couple of books on this. If you find this particularly interesting, I can give you a link to the better part of this video where he does this for about 50 minutes on all different countries. And he traces the lineage of different groups from that in Mesopotamia region to those places, and it just keeps going and going and going and going. Yeah.
So is the implication there that the descendants of Noah tended to be like the leaders and the rulers of these groups, and as they moved in these lands, a lot of the places were named after them?
There is that, yeah. Because these were the guys that would have been the leaders of the group, especially with the family group structure of that. They were, the elder males and stuff. So they would have been the ones that were saying what was.
So a lot of
the
old names of these various lands were straight from
were relative to that
descendants of Noah as they spread out.
Sure. Exactly. We see evidence of that of how we name a lot of cities.
Well, sure,
here.
sure, I know.
The same kind of idea You know.
That's wild that you can trace that all the way
You can
back
still
to
trace that
from
down.
when they spread
Yeah.
out.
I've never seen anybody do that
That's
before
nuts.
to that kind of extent.
Yeah.
But it wasn't much of a stretch.
No.
Yeah.
You can't say that was a stretch at all.
No.
There's a pretty clear path.
Yeah, it's pretty
Yeah.
clear, pretty clear run there. And like I said, I can give you the link for this, as well as the link for the other stuff too.
That's wild.
He has that's from a Zoom meeting that he did in 2020, and with some people in England. And then he has a very much more formal presentation one that he does as well. But this is actually an updated version of that formal presentation. And he says he likes this better because he says nobody really asked me where the people of Japheth went.
Yeah.
They asked me where did the Irish come from,
Yeah.
you know, and stuff like that. So he reformatted it to work that way. So that's I think. Yeah, that's it. So the other thing I wanted to talk about was race. I don't want to have a slide on this because I just wanted to talk about it.
Can I ask one more thing real quick?
Oh yeah.
Back
before
on
we
the other
move.
topic.
Yeah.
Is that also implying then that like these different groups under these different descendants of Noah, each one of them kind of would have had their own language, right? When they split them,
So it's
they
interesting.
would have all kind of gotten a different language and then
When
spread.
Bodhi actually talks about this at one point, but when they boil that down to around the 100 concept of root languages, we can account for about 78 different people groups automatically. And we know that there's some others that we're not accounting for because there probably was some sub-differentiation as well. But the numbers kind of make sense that way, that differentiation would have gone in that way. You know, what I like about that too is that instantaneous complexity of the language also lends itself to why they had to leave.
Yeah.
Because they couldn't
Can't
communicate
interact
with
with
each
each
other.
other.
And there's actually some interesting scientific theory about what happens with groups of people that are incapable of intercommunication on a short-term versus long-term basis. And that leads to things like the villages that get destroyed and stuff like
Well,
that.
and you could imagine as they spread out after generations, they're interacting.
You're incapable of understanding the intentions of the other body, and human beings have a tendency towards violence as an initial problem.
There's also a tremendous amount of research on how much language influences culture. Like you think, oh, well, you have this culture and you just happen to speak that language, but there's a lot more interplay than you think. How your language works influences a lot of even just your thinking patterns and a lot of the cultural elements that follow from that. So there's a tremendous amount of evidence that the cultures would have developed kind of in hand with the language because it's such an influential part of just how people's operate.
The way languages actually put their sentences together, the way they physically form the grammar of their sentences also tends to be reflected in how they interact with each other.
Right. Cultural values.
It's a very interesting issue.
It's incredible.
So there's a lot of really interesting stuff about language. But like I said, if it's not your thing, it becomes boring as dirt. If it is your thing, it can become a tedious 100-hour long venture pretty quick.
That last specific point has an interesting tie-in to the race thing.
Yes,
Sure.
it does. So we were talking about race that you mentioned there. Fundamentally, as the Bible references too, there is actually no concept of race. We are of one blood, okay, and we're all descendants of Adam through Noah. Okay, the concept of race is very much a false one, and actually the science proves this out as well. Okay, so they both actually agree on this issue, that there is no fundamental concept of race. There is one race, and that's the human race. Now what you do see is different skin tones, okay, which arguably actually aren't different skin tones, they're different shade of skin. Because the actual wording of skin tone is a different thing. There's actually only one skin tone. The problem is, where we see this in reality is this. As people groups move closer to the equator, they get darker and taller and skinnier. Okay, thinner, we'll say that. So they get darker and thinner. As you move further away from the equator, they get fatter and whiter. Okay, lighter in skin tone.
Flight to the equator.
The reason for this is very, very important. okay? And God made us this way. He made us adaptive to our environment. It's a very impressive mechanism. But the reason why is a selective pressure. It's microevolution, like we talked about, okay? And how microevolution is something we can very much see. If you're at the equator, you have a much greater exposure to rays of the sun, okay? You actually need a darker skin tone so that you reduce the damage done by the UV rays of the sun, okay? You also have to be taller because you have to develop a way of moderating your temperature. You need greater surface area to muscle mass ratio so that you can get rid of your heat, okay? It's an exothermic process. When you go towards the poles, the reason why you get fatter is because you have to retain your heat, okay? And the reason why you get shorter is because you got to retain that heat, so short and fat. Now the reason why you get paler is because you have a tendency towards vitamin D deficiency. There's a lot less sun exposure, so you have to make the sun exposure more efficient. So the generation of vitamin D is much more active the lighter the skin tone is. Okay? So that's your primary pressures for that. The reason why there's no actual race is because it's actually a smooth gradient. As you move from the poles to the equators, people get a smooth gradient of darker and a smooth gradient of skinny. Okay? And as you move away from the equator to the poles, the exact opposite is true. It is a smooth gradient. There is no fixed line at which you can say this. Now what happens is people get isolated in their groups, okay? Group isolation reduces genetic variability, okay? And the different pressures, different cultural things, things like that. If a culture desires for their men to be bigger and stronger, there will be a higher selective pressure towards bigger and stronger men, okay? Stuff like that. And that selective pressure, frankly, is the same reason why we get dogs the way we do. Different breeds of dogs. Exact same concept, okay? It's a selective tendency, usually due to cultural understanding that does that. Yes, Randy?
Well, we're talking about skin tone and everything, but what about like eye shape and stuff?
Same thing.
Okay.
It's the exact same thing. There's differential, for instance, like we talked about, the genetic grouping of that. If that culture early on in its development developed a fascination with, say, almond eyes, okay, or squinty eyes, okay, then there would be a selective pressure towards that feature, okay? Now, there also might be reasons in their environment why that's effective, all right? And some of those reasons don't exist anymore due to urbanization and technology and stuff. We consistently eliminate the selective pressures around us with things like air conditioning.
Right.
Okay, stuff like that.
Well,
Hold on one second, I think you had a continuing.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so I mean, the reason where I get this is because there's been other takes on this where like maybe the gene pool was so close, and then that's just what happened is they were having children or something like that.
Well, we can
And so
talk
it's
about
interesting, but I like your take on it.
we can
That's
talk
what I was
about the
gonna go.
reduction of lifespan. Okay, there is some reasonable evidence that Noah's wife maybe actually had a genetic issue that led to the reduction of lifespan. There's an interesting situation that occurs when Noah grows the vineyard, okay, and he's drunk and naked in his tent, right? Why is it put on the two sons that put the robe on him? Where's his wife? Okay, that's interesting. Now, we can only infer from that. It doesn't mean diddly squat, okay? It's strictly inferencing, but I do find it an interesting aspect of the conversation. And that there is a genetic bottleneck there.
Yeah.
And that happens. There's different issues involved there. So that could have introduced the nature of the reduction of lifespan.
Of course, there's nothing to prove that. It's just, I'm like, wow, it's just interesting. I'm like, okay,
Yeah,
but I like
it's an interesting conversation
yeah.
to have, but we have no way of externally proving that.
Right.
Beyond maybe the Lord will tell us one day. Exactly,
I like your take on the whole part better.
That take is actually taught. That I taught that construct in college. That the elimination of they actually worked very hard in some of our nomenclature work and stuff to eliminate our concept of race and how it did not exist. And I think in reality, it's a very good understanding of the biblical nature of the events. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, there's like 14 things.
We're gonna have to put it down, 'cause I got short time.
Yeah, okay, slowing down.
There's really
We're
not.
speeding up, I mean. Well, it's interesting because, like, okay, up until very recently, groups typically, you didn't marry or live anywhere past like 25 miles from where you were born.
Yeah, it's
So
hard to
think
get
about
that far. Yeah.
these groups spread out slowly over time, but then they really were kind of self-contained, and so these traits would be emphasized, and that makes sense. But it is interesting in the aspect that you can take a DNA sample of somebody, or look at even just individual bones,
Mhm.
and make pretty strong inclinations in terms of whatever you want to call it, race, descendant, whatever. You can very clearly identify the different
Their features.
subgroups, their
Yeah.
features,
Mhm.
and so what type of people they descended from. So it is interesting in that I understand they all came from Noah,
Mhm.
but at the same time they differentiated enough that you can tell even from individual bones significant differences in these kind of subgroups. So
Yeah, yeah.
you know, biologically that's
We do have the other three wives that create genetic variability, the three
Yeah.
wives of the sons, because they were not descendants of Noah, so we do have that. That's a minor point. But there is a little extra genetic variability.
well, sure, but I meant they all came from a very
Yeah,
small
a very
group,
small grouping.
and yet they managed
Yeah.
to differentiate enough that you can take modern people and go, these are very
Mhm,
clearly
mhm.
separate.
Yeah.
We also
Backgrounds.
never want to take God out of the picture, okay? Because remember always that God is real and in person and interacting, okay? So he's moving these groups around as well. And maybe he had some interesting preferences towards some features and groups. I don't know. There could be some interesting aspects of that. I have seen some interesting videos involving the Lord's preference towards people of different types that are probably mostly hogwash.
Because it
but
is interesting when you start looking at like when you distribute DNA similarities between all these different groups. There's
he
some
would have the
interesting
option
stuff that-
towards the preservation
Yeah.
of certain groups over other groups
Yeah.
as well. You know, the group that lived in Sodom and Gomorrah, you
They
know,
didn't get to
that,
pass
that,
anything
that group
on.
did not get to move
Yeah,
forward.
yeah.
So you know, there are arguments in that venture.
Wrap it up.
So I think that concludes kind of our Tower of Babel reference. I have not been told where we're going next, but I think that gives us a good foundation for that understanding of that, and a reasonable ability to talk about that with people. You know, about where they come from. You know, people talk about their genealogy now and stuff like that, because now we can send in for our DNA test and stuff like that, and we can use that as a stepping stone into the Bible, okay? Because people are willing to talk about that, and you can use information like Bodie Hodges, you know, genetic stuff there in his genealogies to move into that type of discussion, and then talk about the flood and the Tower of Babel and stuff like that. You know, like we said, the interesting nature of complex systems that break down over time, like language, okay? Same thing for the reason why things don't become more ordered. Why evolution is generically a problem, because its argument is that we're moving from a disordered state to a much greater ordered state. Doesn't make any sense at all, and defies all things that we see in the world around us every single day. And those type of arguments are present in this Tower of Babel stuff. So we can use that to move forward, to move people closer to Christ.
And let's not forget, that's the important thing. That's the only reason we talk about this stuff. You're never going to logic somebody into belief. But I want you to make sure that you understand you are not excluded from scientific conversations that people have. That you can take the names of places in Spain and trace that back through the names of Noah's kids and grandkids to get back to Noah, which leads you into a talk about the flood. You can use what we have come to term as race, cultural and physiological differences in people, and you can explain scientifically, but very logically, how that could have been accomplished simply by the fact that people were forced to spread out and go to different places in the world. And when you spend an extended amount of time in a different place in the world, whoever's there begins to develop different traits. It's actually a very easy. You don't have to go any deeper than that. That's all you have to know. Just to let them know, hey, yeah, I hear what you're saying, but that doesn't rule out the Bible. Like the Bible actually explains how that happened.
Yeah. By the way, the difference genetically between me and Mike Hunter is probably about 1/10% of material. That's all.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's mostly the hair.
Now, what's funny
Mostly
about that
the
is the
hair.
difference between
I lack the awesome hair.
the difference between you and a fish is only about 1%. I guess a tiny amount. Like
Yeah. And we can
almost
talk
all
about
living
the universal
things share
nature of
about
builder.
3%.
Yeah.
Like everything else is the exact. Like
So-
it's crazy how much DNA is shared between everything.
We're done. We're done. I'm getting the call sign out here. Please stop talking. Okay. Why don't you pray us out?
Kyla called it. She's done. We're out. Lord, thank you so much for tonight. Thank you for giving us this time of equipping. Lord, just to look at just the surface level of science and Bible and see that these things are not at odds when they're looked at truthfully and honestly. Thank you for the fact that there are logical, reasonable conversations we can have with people who have the science as kind of a religion, and they put their faith in that, and we have entryways into that conversation through these meetings to show them that their faith is just mislabeled. Because the science points to God. The science points to creation. The science points to the stories of the Bible. And so faith is great. It just needs to be redirected to the right place. So I pray that you would allow us to take this information and use it in a way that benefits you, benefits the kingdom, benefits the people who we know, love, and care about. Lord, thank you for our time tonight. I thank you for giving Mike the mind to sift through all this and break it down into bite-sized nuggets for us, so that we can take some of it in. Pray blessings over here for that. Lord, thank you for our time. Thank you for the blessing of it. I pray that you would bless the people as we go and bring us back together as soon as possible to spend more time with you in the Word. It's in Jesus' name. God's people said,
Amen.
Amen. If you're watching online, join us for the prayer meeting, which will start immediately. And if not, we will see you Sunday. But until then,
Love God, love everybody else.
Amen.
Yeah.